If you're not getting called into interviews, the problem is likely not your experience, but how you're communicating it. The real shift in your job search will happen when you learn how to communicate with confidence and credibility, particularly in your resume highlights. So grab your cup of tea and let's talk about how to write resume highlights that instantly gain recruiters' trust. I believe that if you learn to write a well-written resume, this is one of the most important skills that you can develop for your career because it means that you set yourself up to be able to put your best foot forward for any opportunity that you seek. And sometimes, unfortunately, that really unique value that only you have to offer in a marketplace can be lost in a poorly written resume. A resume that is unclear or that is unevidenced or that is buried in generic language, which is so often what these AI written resumes can feel like. And if you read resumes all the time, like I do and like recruiters do, then you learn to spot this language really easily. And the problem is not actually even in the use of the AI technology to write elements of your resume. It is that it's not actually half the time communicating anything that is of actual value. It's not being specific enough. It's like that saying garbage in, garbage out, for example. If you don't actually know what to even prompt these language models to be able to produce for you, then they're not going to be able to produce anything that is going to help you to stand out in the marketplace. On this channel, I've talked about why your resume sounds weak and the tiny mistakes that you are potentially making in your resume. I've talked about how to sell your skills in your resume, and I've also talked about how to write a high caliber cover letter. But I really wanted to focus today specifically on writing those highlights in your resume. Because when I read people's resumes from emerging leaders to executives, I can tell that this is the place that they have put in the most amount of effort, whether they have written it themselves or whether they have written it using AI. I know that so much work goes into this. And what I am hoping that you will get out of this episode is that in the very short time that we will spend together, you will never write those resume highlights the same again, and you will have the knowledge that you need to instantly elevate your resume and to highlight your capabilities and your credibility to a hiring manager. Now, when I talk about the highlights in your resume, what I am referring to specifically are those dot points under the blurbs for the roles that you are focusing on as a part of your resume. And for some people, this can often take the form of just listing responsibilities that you have had in the role. But when you flip this thinking and you see those dot points as either being achievement dot points or highlight orientated dot points, then that means having to talk about your day-to-day responsibilities, at least in that particular section of your resume, becomes redundant. Now, if you do want to learn more about those other sections of your resume, then make sure you check out my earlier episodes on this because I'll explain to you in those episodes what you do in those different areas. But today we're just going to focus on those highlights. Let's start with my point number one, which is to take an action-orientated approach. This is where you are shifting your language from unclear to confident. Recruiters who are reading your resume want to be able to visualize you doing the job. And when you infuse action-orientated language as a priority into those highlights of your professional experience, then you are shifting the tone in your resume from sounding passive to sounding confident, to sounding credible. So this is where verbs become really important. action-orientated words or doing words, making sure that whatever your highlight is, in every place possible, that you are beginning that highlight with a verb. So, for example, just some verbs that may come to mind for this are drove, managed, project managed, led, initiated, spearheaded, pioneered, launched, delivered, facilitated, authored, co-authored, presented, increased, redefined, reinvented, relaunched, redeveloped. And that list could probably go on and on. But don't just stop there with including actions into the start of your dot points. Make sure that you are integrating them through your highlight as well, through the rest of the one or the two or the three lines that follow for that particular point. Always ask yourself, what was the action that was involved to achieve a particular outcome? Don't assume that recruiters understand every aspect of your job. You need to make sure that your outcome is supported by those actions. Even if they understand your role really well, it helps to paint for them really clearly this picture of you doing the job and that you have what it takes to be able to succeed in this role. And where those actions can also become really valuable is that by adding to the outcome with those actions, it adds more character to your resume because it shows not just what you're able to achieve, but how you actually operate, the person that you are in a job, what you prioritize as a part of your role, how you interact with other people. And this leads me to my point number 2, which is tiny storytelling exposition and creating context. Now, every character in a story, whether you are watching a movie or your favorite TV show or you are reading a book, needs to have context created around them so that you understand the world around that person. Because if there wasn't some attention by the authors or by the writers to create some exposition in a story, then the story isn't going to make sense to the audience. We need to know more about where that person sits in a bigger picture. We need to understand more about what is happening around them, particularly even as they relate to the achievements and the highlights that you are including in your resume. If you simply communicate an outcome, for example, with no context, then you lose a lot of the value that you were trying to communicate in the first place. So, for example, instead of a highlight that says that you increase sales year on year by 7%, you might instead say, increased 2025 financial year sales by 12% in a declining fashion retail market, turning around 3 consecutive years of negative sales revenue growth, led a new market entry and partnership strategy to leverage market opportunities, returning the business to profitability. So 2 very different approaches to the same point, but only one that actually highlights the value that you can bring to an organization. And that leads me to my point number 3, which is credibility signals, and this idea of turning fluff into facts for high impact proof points. So when a lot of people are unsure about the quality of their resume, they focus a lot on if they are selling themselves and if they are sounding as confident as they could be. And as I've talked about in my earlier episodes, that is really important. You need to sound confident in your resume. You can't have a resume that sounds weak, because if you aren't convinced, then you're not going to be able to convince a recruiter to hire you. But what can often be lost when you are focusing so much on sounding confident is that you also need to sound credible. Because if you are so focused on making these really confident statements about your capabilities without any evidence or without any data to support that, then those points that you have put so much effort into sounding confident in can just come across as mere hyperbole to a hiring manager. And so that is where adding proof points to the highlights that you have included on your resume are really important. So, for example, this might be things like sales value, it could be your project value, budget, percentage growth like sales, social media, profitability, staff productivity. This could be the number of stakeholders you consulted with. This could be the number of participants, the number of attendees, the number of people you presented to. This could be the number of hours saved. This could be the number of workshops facilitated. This could be project timelines. This could be cost savings, or it could be quantifying efficiencies gained. So when you start to think about every highlight in terms of quantifying as much as possible, you instantly add more credibility to your points, and your resume also becomes much more interesting to read because your numbers are going to pop on the page. They give a recruiter that is skimming your resume something for the eyes to be able to land on. So as an example of applying this, you might say, delivered 25 workshops Australia-wide over 3 months, presenting to an average of 50 plus participants per workshop. Now, I'm going to actually come back to this example because it's not actually complete. There's still more that you can do here as well. But you also don't want to be so hyper-focused on numbers that you are trying to include them where it's not actually relevant. The key point here is to add the numbers that are going to increase your value proposition, that are going to tell that story in a more complete way. When you can't quantify in ways that are relevant or compelling or even valuable, make sure that you're still finding ways to be specific, to add evidence that converts vague statements into something that better sells your capabilities. So for example, if you authored new policies and procedures, then actually state what at least some of those policies and procedures were. Actually give examples. Or if, for example, you're talking about aligning with regulations or legislation, then cite, for example, the relative acts related to that or the relative regulations in your industry. If, for example, you're also talking about consulting extensively with stakeholders, then state who some of those stakeholders are. What were their roles? Were they, for example, internal teams that you collaborated with? Were they senior management or executives? Were they potentially external providers that you can highlight as a part of showing your capability in having those relationships? And this is where, again, it becomes less important to talk about your day-to-day responsibilities because you're being more specific through that lens of the highlight about what you are able to achieve anyway. So people can see that you have the capabilities to take those actions, to manage those relationships, to have those interactions. So let's have a look at an example that doesn't include numbers, but is still really specific about the impact that you have had. We could say, for example, authored and implemented a suite of pioneering organizational policies and procedures, including across customer service, social media, and safety, establishing new ways of working and fostering a high performance culture. And as you would have noticed in that point as well, is that it includes an outcome. It highlights the impact of actually doing those things. So recruiters don't just want to know what you've done in your job. They want to know that the work that you did had an impact, or they want to understand why that work mattered. So let's revisit that earlier point where we said delivered 25 workshops Australia-wide over 3 months, presenting to, on average, 50 plus participants per workshop. Now, the part that is missing from that sentence is more of the outcome. So you could finish off the rest of that point then by saying, on average, 50 plus participants per workshop, educating on social media competition compliance regulations for fashion retailers nationally. But where you place your outcomes is also something that you should be paying attention to. And that leads me to my point number 4, which is your highlight hooks. So let's talk about gaining attention up front and the last words. Now, we know that with any good writing, a hook is what compels you to keep reading. It is one of the most important elements of any piece of copywriting. But there's also another reason why this is important, and that is because as humans, the research has shown that we have a primacy bias, which means that we tend to remember everything that we hear first the most, which means that you want to make sure that you're putting the most important information up front in your point. So that might be the outcome that is the strongest part of that communication, or it might be the action, for example, that is so significant that that is what goes up front in your point. But the point is to make sure that you are being strategic about where the different information is placed in your point. So let's look at an example of a great hook, and we could say, awarded the Staff Member of the Year recognition among 250 staff for leading a groundbreaking online partnership distribution strategy that increased sales revenue by 25%. So as you can see in that, we have a hook, we have context in terms of why that award is even more significant than the reader might realize. We have actions in that, and then we also have an outcome. Now, if you have the wonderful problem of having so much value to communicate about a particular point that you're not sure where to put all of the information, then the other really great thing about humans is that we also have a recency bias, which means that we also tend to remember the information that we hear last. So the information at the end of your point can also be really prime real estate for your highlight. So just remember that it is the start and the end of your points that people are going to remember the most. And it is those things, unfortunately, in the middle that can potentially be forgotten. But a really key aspect, whether you're talking about the start of your point or the end of your point, is to always be communicating, wherever relevant, a transformational state. So you're communicating the outcome. You're communicating the impact that only you have had in an organization. And this is where the huge shift from having a resume that reads like a job description, like a copy and paste of a job description, can happen, because you instead sound like only you can have this impact in a workplace. And my tip number 5 is to create visual contrast in your resume. And this is where you are ensuring that your value actually pops on the page of your resume, because sometimes it's not all about just the words that you are including on your resume, but it is about how you are presenting those words. And this is where you can be really tactful about your use of bolding through your resume, or in some cases, some really minimal italics may also help through some elements of those points. But what bolding can do, particularly at the start of your point or the most relevant value that you have to offer in that point, is that it directs the attention of your recruiter, who is likely skimming your resume, in a much more meaningful way. You're making sure that if they are only quickly reading your resume, which they most likely are, that they are getting the most valuable information. So while you are writing those points, make sure that as a part of that strategy, you are bolding the most important information up front. And do this as you are writing those points, because understanding the hook that you are bolding is also going to help to inform how you're writing the rest of that point. And this could be the difference between a resume that overwhelms a recruiter and one that communicates your unique value and lands you an interview for your next job. Thanks so much. For more on writing resumes that recruiters can't ignore, then make sure you check out my earlier episodes on these topics. I'll see you in the next episode.